But the web is, of course, all about hyperlink, hypertext markup language, where you click on something and you end up somewhere else. And this is how the web is so powerfully interconnected. So how do we start creating links from one website or web page to another, either that I made or someone else? Well, let me go ahead and open back up my terminal window. And let's create a file called link.html just to demonstrate what you and I know as a link. I'll hide my terminal window now. Let me copy paste just to save myself some keystrokes. And let me get rid of the video tag so we can focus now on links. Suppose that I want you to visit Harvard virtually. Well, I could say something like visit Harvard, period. This is uninteresting because it's just going to be text. I probably want you to actually visit harvard.edu instead, more specifically. And I'll lowercase it just to be consistent with what browsers do in the address bar. All right, let me go now to the video, back to this video tab and go back where we now see my index. I'll zoom back in, and there's link.html. Unfortunately, when I click this, and I'll zoom in, you literally just see the text that I wrote. And yet, on every social media platform nowadays, except like Instagram, when you type a URL or what looks like a URL, even if you didn't bother with the HTTP or HTTPS, it usually automatically links it for you on Facebook, on Twitter, and other sites as well. That's just a convenience. Discord and Slack do that too, but they're just doing it to make things more user-friendly. But they have to generate HTML with the proper tags and attributes. So to get this to actually work, it's not even good enough to say https://www.harvard.edu, because if I go back now and reload now, you'll literally just see all of that as text. If you want the browser to treat this as a link, you need to use the anchor tag. It'd be great if it were called the link tag, but it's not. It's called the anchor tag, or A for short. And the way you reference the URL to which you want to lead the user is via href, for hyperreference. This is one of the earliest tags, perhaps among the most arcane now. But if I then put that whole URL in quotes and close my tag, I now have an opportunity to finish my thought in between the start tag and the end tag for this anchor. And what I put in between the start and end tag is whatever the human's going to see. So here I can say Harvard. I can go back to my other tab. I can reload the page. And now you see the familiar blue underline. This now is an actual link. And if I click it, I'll be whisked away to the actual Harvard website. But there's a risk here. Can anyone imagine, pretty simply, after like, what, 60 seconds of the link tag, of the anchor tag, how could someone, an adversary, misuse this tag alone? How could a website run by an adversary, how could a spammer misuse this tag, do you think? Yeah?
Could have had it say, like, visit Yale, and then some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. You could have it say one thing but lead elsewhere. So I could say Yale in here. Nothing's stopping me as the developer. Go back to the page, reload. Now it says visit Yale. You click on Yale, and voila, you end up applying to the wrong place instead. Now there's some hints of this. I could hover over this, and super small, like this isn't very good for your anti-hacking techniques, but way down here you can actually see the URL that it's going to go to. And most browsers indeed do this, at least on desktops and laptops. So it's a little bit of a hint. But what you're seeing here, even though this is kind of a silly, playful example, this is exactly how phishing attacks work, P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G work, whereby an adversary tells you to log into your PayPal account, but it doesn't go to paypal.com. It goes to some other random website that they bought and built that then tries to collect your username and password and store it in their database, so now they can log into your PayPal account as you. And it boils down to that simple primitive. And you can be even more manipulative too. You can even say the whole URL for Yale, like yale.edu, or worse, https://www.yale.edu. Reload that, and now I mean, who among you and people in your lives are necessarily going to be so paranoid as to not just blindly click on that URL? This is why just being a defensive, real-world person nowadays digitally is just ever more so important. So these same things that can be used for good or benign use cases can also be used for ill purposes too. And it is literally that simple. Questions now on any of these tags thus far? Just a few more to offer up. Any questions on this here? No? Well, let me open up a couple couple that I brought in advance just so we don't have to type all of them here. If you, for instance, have a web page that's got quite a bit of code, let me go ahead and grab from the website a couple of examples real fast here, namely one that we'll call, how about meta.html. And in this example here, give me just a moment to full screen it, we're going to have a file, so code meta.html. I'll open this up next. No relationship to what we now know as Meta, the company, but rather this is going to be a page that shows, oops, let's hide some of this first. Pretend that didn't happen. OK, this meta.html now is a page that I copied and pasted the same chunk of Latin-like text from earlier. So it's going to be a really big paragraph of text. And this is an example where if you were to open this web page, not on my own Mac or your PC, but on your phone, the font might actually be really annoying and difficult to read. Why? Because your phone's going to try to squeeze all of the content onto the tiny viewport, the rectangular region of your phone instead. So it turns out there are ways, pretty easy ways, to make your website mobile friendly as well, otherwise known technically as responsive. And the easiest way to do this is to include this tag here, a meta tag. Again, no relationship to Facebook. This has been here much longer. And in this case here, this meta tag on line 5 has its own sort of approach to key value pairs. This is a good example of where it'd be nice if it looked just like everything else, but this is what we have historically. You can have a meta tag with an attribute called name that refers to the name of some feature of the browser. In this case, viewport is the technical term for like the big rectangular region to which I keep referring, the body really of your page. The content for the viewport, you can say some esoteric details like this. The initial scale should be 1. That is, no matter who visits your site, it shouldn't start zoomed in. It shouldn't start zoomed out. It should start at just the default sizing. And then this here, width equals device width, is a very arcane way of saying if the user has a small screen, show the text proportional to that size. Don't just try to cram it all into a tiny little window. So it's super simple. But if, for the next problem set or future projects as well, you find that just things look really bad on mobile, like this kind of tag is the place to start Meta. There aren't terribly many of these that you'll use, but they're useful for other mechanisms as well. In fact, let me go ahead and semi-secretly pull up one other example as well, whereby I'm going to grab another example that uses more of these tags. And in just a moment, I'll reveal it here. Give me just 1 second here. I'll propose that in this example of Meta, we now add these properties instead. So I copy-pasted this from an existing file just so as to not waste time typing all of these out. If you've ever shared a URL on Facebook or Twitter or Slack or Discord or any number of websites nowadays that automatically show a nice preview where you suddenly see like the default image of the page, maybe a few sentences or words of text or something like that, sometimes those applications, those websites, will just choose like the first image it finds on the website or the first sentence it sees and show that. But that might not be very user-friendly or search engine friendly. And so a developer might want to control what it is that Slack, Discord, Facebook, Twitter, and other such sites show by default. For that, you can use nowadays what are called open graph tags, which is to say there's other uses of the meta tag. And you just look these things up. Even I had to look this up to remember what the key value pairs are. The meta tag can also have a property attribute that can be these very specific strings, OG title, OG description, OG image, which denotes open graph, which again is this standard that's evolved in recent years. And what you can do here is tell browsers and in turn servers what you want them to show as the default title of the page, the description of the page, and even the default image, just so you can exercise more control when sharing things socially nowadays as well. Again, it just boils down to these key value pairs. This is absolutely the kind of thing you look up as needed to cross-check, but those capabilities are there. And so literally, the next time you paste a link into Slack or Discord or any online site that then displays it in embedded fashion, just know that all this time, a little bit of textual code like this in HTML has been there by whoever authored the site. All right, let's do one final example in HTML alone before we transition to just cleaning up the aesthetics and improving the visuals of everything we've been creating. Let me go ahead here and close meta.html. Let me code up a new file called, how about, search.html, and see if we can't draw some inspiration from our cursory understanding earlier of how URLs work to see if we can't reinvent google.com itself. So recall that a canonical URL might look like this here. And in particular, if you want to pass in user input to that URL, again, you can potentially have a question mark and then a key equals value pair. Or for that matter, you can even have multiple key value pairs that by convention are separated by ampersands. These things are everywhere. Like later today, when you pull up almost any website in your browser, look at the URL, and you'll just see a lot of this. A lot of noise, too, and distractions. But there's going to be some equal signs, most likely, and or some ampersands as well. And those are just separating key value pairs. Now, what can I do here? Well, if you think back to how we manually searched for cats earlier, let me quickly do this. I'll do this one manually. Doc type HTML as my very first line. HTML tag with, how about, my lang attribute for English up here. And then inside of this, I'll have a head tag. Inside of this, I'll have a title. I'll call this example search. And then down here, I'll have my beginning of a body tag. And now, let me introduce you to really a final tag for now, a form tag, which will create a web form, the thing with text boxes and buttons that you and I use every day on any number of websites. Inside of this form, I'm going to have an input, like a text box, whose name is going to be Q for query, because I'm trying to re-implement Google here. The type of that, I want to be a text box, or if I know I'm using this for search, I can actually change this to a search box, and it's going to let me, it's going to generally put a little X there so you can clear it quickly. That's a nice little enhancement as well. And then I'm going to give myself a submit button by doing input. Whoops. I'm going to give myself a submit button by doing input type equals submit, and then I'll leave that as such here. All right, now I need to do a little bit more, but let's see how this looks. Let me go over to my other tab. Let me go back to my index. And if I zoom out, there is search.html. I'll click it. And there's not much going on here, even if I zoom in. But I do indeed have a really big text box and a submit button. But I haven't in my HTML told anyone anywhere that I want this input, whether I type cat or dog, to go to google.com. So for that, I need a couple of more attributes. And I know this from having done this before, and any online reference will say the same. You can add an action attribute, like what do you want the action of this form to be? And you can put the URL to which you want this form to be submitted. And I know from tinkering that it should be https://www.google.com/search. I don't need to put any question marks here myself, but I do want the browser to do that for me. So let me go back to my other tab. Let me reload. And nothing visually has happened. But watch this. When I now type in cats, but before I hit enter, notice that I'm currently at some long, crazy URL /search.html as expected. If I now go down to the submit button and click submit, watch what happens to the URL and the page itself. I'm whisked away to the actual google.com. And indeed, there are those same cats. And if I zoom in here, you'll see that my URL has changed to be indeed /search?Q equals cats. So this is just how web forms work. When you submit any form on the web in this way, the browser automatically goes to that action URL, adds a question mark, puts any key value pairs that you manually typed into the text boxes, and lets the server do its thing. Now, here's where Chrome is starting to simplify things. Safari does this too. If you double click on your URL, now you see the full URL. But if any parts are missing, that's just a UI thing to eliminate visual distractions nowadays. Meanwhile, if I go back to my own form, if I search this time for dogs and hit enter, now again, the URL changes to be Q equals dogs. And it all reduces to this basic building block of using a form tag. Now, I can be more explicit. If I know I want to use get, which is actually the default, I can literally say, quote unquote, get in all lowercase, even though the verb earlier was by design in uppercase. But here now, I'm just being ever more explicit. If I don't want the label of this button to be very generically submit, maybe I want it to be Google search, quote unquote. Well, if you read the documentation for forms, you can actually change the value of the button to be, quote unquote, Google search. And if I now go back here and reload, I get a fresh form. And now I get a button that literally says Google search. And if I tinker with this further, because this isn't very user-friendly, there's even more attributes I can do. I can add on my search input, a autocomplete equals off if I don't want to see my own history for whatever reason. I don't want people knowing I'm searching for cats and dogs on this page. I can autofocus on the text box so that it shows the cursor blinking in that box by default. And I can even do something like this. I can have a placeholder attribute that says something like query or some other documentation for the user. And if I now go back and reload, you'll see, notice, it says query, and it's subtle, but my cursor is already positioned there. It gave it focus, and I can type cats now without having to click in the box manually, which is just marginally better for the user's experience. Any questions now on all of this here? Any questions? All right, that too was a lot. Why don't we take a casual 5-minute break, and when we resume, we'll take a look at CSS, add in some JavaScript, and then wrap up. So 5 minutes only for now.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد رسولنا النبي الأمي المبعوث رحمة للعالمين خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين نور هذه الأمة وضياؤها وشفيعنا يوم الحساب